Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so excited to be here to introduce today's Lunch and Learn. We're going to be talking about the 521. Recently had done the ARPA legislation, and when we had the ARPA legislation, we were able to go ahead and utilize some of the money and create what we call right now a 521 fund, where we're able to go ahead and repurpose the money regarding that the ARPA fund so that we can utilize it without having any of the restrictions of the Treasury, meaning the restrictions of the deadlines and restriction of when that time of use needs to. We need to go ahead and utilize that money, which is the restrictions which we have on the ARPA money currently. I think definitely this is an exciting opportunity for Navajo so that we can go ahead and continue to decide and understand what we're wanting to go ahead and use that ARPA funding money for as well. I apologize for the little stutter on that. Just to introduce myself, I am Deputy Attorney General Heather Claw for the Navajo Nation Department of Justice. I'm Kia'ani, born for Clash Chi'i. My Chays are Todet Chini and my Nellies are Tot Chini. And I'm here, I'm proud and excited to introduce the controller, Mr. Sean McCabe. He's definitely have been a tool when as the controller. Very outward thinking person. What do we need to do in order to go ahead and continue to move the financials of how to use the financials and how to go ahead and maintain proper procedures in there in order to go ahead and safe fund the Navajo Nation's money. It's definitely been a pleasure to work with Sean. Sean, do you want to go ahead and give yourself a quick introduction?
Sure. Thank you, Heather.
Oh, we can't hear you, Sean. I'm wondering if it's the sound. Do you have you on mute? So, well, we're going to go ahead and see what's going on with the technical difficulties with Sean's. Let's go ahead and introduce Mrs. Catherine Boloski. She's the Assistant Attorney General for the EDCU, and that's Economic Development and Chapter Unit. Catherine has been great to work with. Definitely have appreciated her management of that unit. And for a short time, she was also managing the tax and finance unit, assisting us to go ahead and do both for a short time. So, Catherine, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Heather. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Catherine Bolzowski. As Deputy stated, I am the Assistant Attorney General for the Economic Community Development Unit here at the Navajo Nation Department of Justice. You probably have seen my face on a couple of these Lunch of Learns at this point, but I'm really happy to be here today to talk about the creation of this new 521 fund that the Navajo Nation government has been working on for the past several months. And hopefully, if Comptroller is able to jump back on, he can kind of talk about this, because I think really the work we've done here at the Department of Justice has been to help support the leadership's vision for the creation of this fund. And so I'll kind of maybe just give a little background into, there we go. And our controller's here. No need to keep talking. Okay.
Go ahead, Sean. I don't know what's going on with the sound, Sean. We can't hear you. We can see your face.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, can hear you now.
No, sorry. Somehow I got kicked to the backstage again, so sorry about that. But anyway, I was just introducing myself. My name is Sean McCabe. As Heather said, I'm the controller for the Navajo Nation. I'm a CPA licensed in New Mexico, and just have been doing work for tribal governments for almost 30 years now. And just my clans I'm Ashi'i, I'm born for Tachini. And basically from my father's side of the family from Winter Rock, Arizona area, and my mother's side from Yambato, New Mexico. So just happy to be here and have the opportunity to work with this great team we have, and happy to talk about 521.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you experts to help share the public what this fund is, what does it mean, and the possibilities of the use of the fund according to the Navajo Nation leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. So, all right, Controller, well, it's great to have you here. I'm really happy you're able to take the time. I know you're really busy to talk a little bit more about this 521 fund with the Navajo people. So, I just thought, do you mind maybe just kind of giving us a little background on? Let's just start on, back in the beginning with the ARPA money, right? So this 521 fund is being created with ARPA funds. Can you just talk a little bit about the ARPA funds and kind of what they are and where they came from?
Yeah, no, thank you, Catherine. So, as most people know, the tribes during the COVID-19 pandemic received basically two more or less unprecedented amounts of money to help um, tribal governments get through the pandemic period and the economic, uh, in a lot of cases, economic devastation that the pandemic created with a lot of closures, et cetera. And the first tranche of money was in the CARES Act. Everyone, I think, is familiar with that. And that happened at the very beginning of the pandemic. And the Navajo Nation received some money for that. And I know the prior administration had issued a lot of that money through hardship payments, et cetera. As the pandemic continued to uh, be an issue and still were issues for the economy, the new administration, the Biden administration, released the American Rescue Plan Act, which is what we now know as ARPA, um, as we call it. And that also gave another pretty large chunk of money to tribes around the country to utilize for specific purposes. Basically, those monies were to be utilized in response to the pandemic, and there were some specific uses. And what happened was the Navajo Nation received just under $2.1 billion for the ARPA money, and we were to use that for mostly capital related projects. The money had to be spent, still has to be allocated by December 31, 2024, and then subsequently spent by December 31, 2026. And so part of the allowable allocation within the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, is what is known as revenue replacement. And what the United States Treasury allows governments to do, including tribal governments, including the Navajo Nation, is to identify. There's a calculation we had to use over the course of the pandemic, starting in 2019 to today, really, even. And we were to identify what is known as government services that are funded by the general fund. So government services that aren't funded by federal sources, but funded by a tribal general fund, where revenues were decreased because of the pandemic. And through this calculation, we were able to identify over the course between March 2019 through 2024, the Navajo Nation was able to identify government service expenditures that we paid for in the absence of revenues of roughly $521 million. The Navajo Nation, per the Treasury guidelines, was then able to take that calculation, reimburse the general fund retroactively throughout those years for all those services we provided without that revenue due to closures. Um, we were able to utilize revenue loss in our enterprises. And quite frankly, that's where most of the revenue loss occurred. The closures of the casino, declining revenues at NTEC and other enterprises. And one way or the other, the Navajo Nation was able to calculate over many months $521.8 million that are now available in the general fund because we reimbursed ourselves for those expenditures. So as Deputy AG mentioned, those monies are now are in the process actually being converted to general fund dollars, and thereby ridding the reimbursement. Those monies can now be expended without the ARPA regulations of the deadlines and usages. So um, we're very happy. I mean, one of the things, this is kind of historical and unprecedented. It's not very often that the federal government gives a provision to say, go ahead and reimburse yourselves for money you spent in declining revenues and use that money for purposes that you see fit. So that's exactly what the Navajo Nation has done, and that's basically the beginnings of the creation of the 521 fund, which has now um, been legislated and signed by the president.
Thank, thank you, Controller. So just kind of to go back a little bit on, I think you gave a lot of information there. What was the originally when the Navajo Nation received this money from the federal government in 2021? What was the money originally allocated for?
So the Navajo Nation, when the money first came out, there was a legislation that passed a couple of years ago that allocated the money to chapter regional plans. There was a hardship given, which cost the nation roughly $550 million, and that was sent out early in the ARPA plan. Uh, the other allocations for the money were primarily to infrastructure projects like housing, um, water projects, broadband. And then there was a 10% allocation that could be used by tribes for administrative costs. Um, and a lot of our money was also allocated toward roads, and again, those water projects through NTUA and non-NTUA projects. So the focus of the beginning of the money was a lot of capital improvement. And at the beginning, the 521 wasn't contemplated. And I can speak to that here in a little bit more about that. But the original allocations of money again went primarily to hardship chapter delegate region plans or delegate region chapter plans, and then a lot of infrastructure projects.
Mm-hmm. So approximately how much money has the Navajo spent of that original allocation from Treasury?
So as of the date of the calculation that was used in the legislation, there was roughly $1.3 billion left to be spent, somewhere between 1.2 and 1.3. And our original allocation was just under 2.1 billion. So about 800 million had been spent through March 31st, 2024. 550 million of that was the hardship, and then roughly 150 more was NTUA projects. So outside of NTUA and hardship, only 100 to 200 million dollars had been spent by the prior administration in the ARPA money.
So we during this expenditure of the ARPA money, the Navajo Nation obviously had a change in leadership, and you came in as controller after the initial allocation had been done in 2022 of this money. And when you came into your position, what were some of the things that you noticed in regards to, or kind of what concerns and thoughts did you have when you kind of looked at how the nation had allocated and was spending its ARPA money, and what kind of led you to this idea of doing revenue replacement?
Well, I think the real catalyst behind getting the 521 calculated and put into place was the alarmingly low spending rate of the ARPA money. And we had actually several consultation calls with the United States Treasury directly where they asked us the same thing, because the Navajo Nation is required to report by quarter to the Treasury all monies that have been allocated and spent under ARPA. And so Treasury, when I came on board, one of the first things I did was meet with them, and they said, hey, you guys got 2.1 billion and you've barely spent any of it. Is there a plan? And I think that was really the catalyst that kind of pushed us into, okay, what are we really going to do? Like we have to get this money spent by December 2026. If we don't, we're going to have to send it back to the federal government, and nobody wants to do that. So there was a fairly month-long effort, and I got to give credit to DOJ, um, the president's office and the budget and finance committee for really kind of taking this back under their wings and say, we need to revisit this whole thing and look at it, identify projects that we know can be completed by 2026, use that for the ARPA money, and then the remaining ARPA money, but then take that 521, which is allowable by the Treasury, and move it over to the general fund so that we have that allocation done, which is allowable, but also gives us some flexibility on how we spend that money.
Mhm. And so you talked a little bit about the December 2026 deadline, which is the date where whatever money the nation doesn't spend, we have to give back to the federal government. And I know you briefly touched upon it, but there's also that one other deadline, right, that's coming up at the end of this year, and which is kind of one of the hurdles the nation has to hit first before it even gets to the 2026. And what is that one at the end of that deadline coming up in 2024?
Oh yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Kevin. I apologize I didn't explain that earlier. So per the federal government, for the Treasury, all tribes have to have all ARPA funds allocated or obligated by December 31st, 2024. Any unobligated funds as of that date must also be returned. But the good news is with this legislation that the president signed a couple of weeks ago, all money is now at least allocated. It's now the responsibility of the federal government, of our government, I'm sorry, to put those monies under contract and what we call encumbered, and then keep those monies, and that's what the federal government calls obligated as December 31, 2024.
So was one of the one of the struggles I think you mentioned is that a lot of our money, the council may have allocated it in 2022, we weren't really seeing a lot of the getting obligated right under contracts. And I think that was one of the concerns that the leadership had, was just the slow rate, as you mentioned, kind of the slower rate that we were moving at to actually put this money under contract, and we're getting very close to December.
Yeah.
So, but under as you were stating, under the revenue replacement, this money is now has moved itself over. So, can you maybe kind of just go into detail what money is actually part of that? Because as we talked about, council had allocated money in 2022 to projects, and now we're under the CMY 2024 that was passed by council and signed by president. Now some of that money that had been originally slotted for ARPA for projects, as you stated, kind of capital projects under ARPA, is now being moved to this fund. And so how is that, what did your office look at in kind of determining which monies should be moved over, and what are some of the benefits now that money is for those projects, now that they're going to be moved to the general fund?
No, that's a great question, because I know a lot of people want to know, well, what happens to that money now? Is it just now a big, I hate to use the term, but a big slush fund for the government to use? And that's not at all the intent or the purpose of the money. So to answer your question, what the calculation that had to be made is we looked at the original allocation of just under 2.1 billion. Obviously, we subtracted out immediately everything that's been spent, because it's been spent. We can't get that back. And we also subtracted out anything that's already been contracted or encumbered. So anything that had been contracted or encumbered as of March 31 under ARPA stayed where it was. And then in addition to that, through talks and negotiations between legislative and executive, the bulk of the housing allocations through ARPA also remained intact, as did much of the water projects. The biggest change, I think, that was reallocated from the original calculation was the movement of more money to NTUA for wastewater treatment plants. And it was decided that those were important because those could serve as catalysts for, better living conditions for the people, also economic development opportunities that come with better access to water. And then also there was a supplementary allocation to housing of roughly 63 million. And then the 521, and I can get into the details of what's in there right now, but essentially all the 521 did was it took all of the delegate region chapter plans that were under ARPA and moved them intact over to the 521. So all of those plans are still intact for every chapter region plan. They're just now going to be funded out of the general fund. And there were reasons for that. One of the reasons is the slow rate of expenditure by the chapters created a concern as to whether or not the chapters could get that money spent by December, obligated and spent by December 2026. And it was decided at the leadership level that we didn't want to take that risk. So why not just move it over to the general fund where those deadlines no longer apply? So that's exactly what happened. They moved roughly 150 million unencumbered, unspent money from ARPA to the general fund, removed all those restrictions. So now the chapter plans can continue forward without worrying about having to spend it or obligate it by deadlines. And in essence, what else it did is it moved the money out of federal requirements so that all these chapters wouldn't have to get a single audit. So there's a lot of benefits and flexibility for the reason why that moved over to 521. The other project that most notably got moved over from ARPA to 521 largely stayed intact, but just got to a different funding source is the broadband project. So really, everything stayed intact from the delegate region plans and the broadband. It's just now funded not from ARPA money, but from the 521 revenue replacement. And again, the reasons for that really, the the motivation behind that was really moving projects that we didn't think were likely to get done by the ARPA deadlines, move them to the general fund where those deadlines no longer apply, but keep the original intent intact. And that was the case with those two big ones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So now all those chapter projects, right? They don't have to have money under contract by the end of December, and
Right.
the money doesn't have to be expended by December 2026. They have a lot more time to really develop and utilize their funds as best they see fit.
Right. And I think one of the things that might be discussed at some point is with the flexibility now, because one of the main topics that came up during this whole calculation is, these allocations that happened early on, those were allocations done in the midst of the pandemic where priorities were a little bit different than they are now that we're out of the pandemic. They were done by a prior council, they were done by a prior administration. So maybe some of the priorities at the chapter levels may have changed. And the good thing about moving the chapter projects to the 521 is it now provides some flexibility, and the leadership still has to decide whether or not chapters who maybe allocated money, say, to a new chapter house now might think, or maybe allocated money to heavy equipment that might not, because that was a priority back in 2021, 2022. Now it may not be so much a priority. Can we use that money for something else? And the answer is it's possible, but I think we still need to contemplate that flexibility. But now that the money's under the general fund, it provides a lot of flexibility on replanning and repurposing that money, and really kind of cater to the priorities of the chapters as they sit today, as opposed to where they were when the original legislation was passed in 21, 22.
Yeah. So, in kind of just to reemphasize what what comptroller stated is that we were ARPA gives us very limited uses of the money, right? It has to be responding to COVID. And I know at our office, the Department of Justice, we've spent a lot of time over the past couple of years vetting, projects that were submitted by chapters and divisions and saying like, yes, this is eligible under ARPA. No, this isn't eligible. And now with all that money being moved over to the 521, there will, DOJ no longer has to vet because we no longer have to comply with those strict ARPA usage requirements. So I know that's made my office very happy to know that a lot of that has been taken away, and a lot more flexibility has been given back to the local communities to kind of figure out which projects will best service them. So in regards, this really is a pretty historic creation at this point that the Navajo leadership has done with this money. Now that the money's moved over, this money that was, Fed ARPA money, and now is being moved over to Navajo Nation funds. What is the Office of the Comptroller's kind of like vision? My understanding is that the fund is in the process of being established, and right now the money is kind of just in a holding account until that council creates the actual fund for it. But what is some of your hopes, at least as the comptroller? What do you hope to kind of see leadership kind of structure the fund and be utilized? Kind of what parameters to put in place to help this fund be successful for the Navajo people?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Catherine. And one of the ideas I've pitched to leadership, really when from the very beginning, when we kind of figured out, what this fund could be, and the number that the 521 kind of changed over time. At first, it was four. I think it started at three something, then it went to 488, and then it actually finally got finalized at 521. And kind of the idea that as we had leadership meetings over the past few months was, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's not very often where the federal government allows a tribe to take federal money, reimburse itself, and then open up the usage to really whatever we want to do with it. And so it's kind of a historic windfall of $500 million to the Navajo Nation. And so what I would love to see happen, and the idea that we've pitched at OOC, is why don't we take that money, treat it as like an endowment, if you will. So keep the money intact. Don't just spend it. Allow the Navajo Nation to use it as collateral, and the investment in income that comes off of it, which could be to the tune of $30-40 million a year. Have that $34 million a year finance a bond issuance. So that 521 remains intact. It's not spent. We go borrow against it, use the interest off to pay for the debt, and then achieve all the projects that were originally slated for the 521. When the debt's paid off, you still got 521 left in the bank, and just do it again and borrow it and just keep it going, so that $500 million of projects can be done over time, over and over and over again. And what we don't want to do is restrict that money either. We don't want to create a lot of red tape around it. There will be, if that plan goes through, the money will most likely be restricted to capital projects, but we won't say it has to be for certain reasons, because we do want to have flexibility going forward. I think we have a tendency to put a lot of our own red tape around things when it comes to money, and it's the position of the Office of the Controller to try and break down that red tape and those walls and just keep that money flowing for the Navajo people. And there's also plans to maybe increase that fund to upwards of $1 billion with ARPA interest and other related monies that could then increase the capacity for the Navajo Nation to borrow even more money and just put down, anywhere between $500 million to $1 billion of projects every 10 to 15 years. And so that's a long way of saying the Office of Controller very highly recommends to leadership, take that money, set it aside, borrow against it, keep it intact, and we can do this over and over and over again into the future.
Mm-hmm. And has this been, I know this is your first time comptroller, but I think you're a repeat Navajo Nation employee. Like, have you seen, just in your time working with the nation in the various capacities, have you seen the nation set up anything of this nature in the past with its other funds? As I'm sure people are aware, the Navajo Nation has many funds and has over time set up different kind of instruments for it to be able to kind of leverage its money. Is this similar to anything that the nation has done in the past, or is this a pretty new idea for moving forward?
The idea of setting funds aside for specific purposes is not new. The Citizen Fund was done in a manner similar, where we got an amount of money from a settlement, I believe, and we set it aside and said these monies are to be utilized for certain purposes.
Mm-hmm.
What's different, and what's really kind of the first time Navajo has contemplated this, is setting aside the money and do what we call leveraging it by borrowing against it. In fact, it's fairly new, because as I understand, the legal framework behind it isn't even really set in place yet. There's a law on the Navajo Nation called the Bond Financing Act that will need to be amended to take full advantage of what we could do with this money. So the idea of setting money aside and using it for purposes is not a new concept. Citizen's an example, the Citizen Fund. But the idea of kind of moving into a different way of thinking about our money by saying, let's take this basically gift from from the federal government, stick it in a fund where we can earn interest on it, leverage it and borrow against it so we can keep doing that into the future. That's a new concept that I'd really, and really what it comes down to is really taking a Navajo Nation asset, which a lot of people refer to as the people's money, take that and make that money work for us, make it work for us, make it finance projects, not just as an account that continues to grow and nobody sees the benefit of it. So really taking some money that was put in place, borrow against it, uh, utilize the borrowing proceeds from it to put real projects down that Navajo people can see progress with, and then just do it again in a few years and keep doing it over and over again. So that the new part of this idea is the leveraging piece and borrowing against it.
And because I think this is kind of a new concept for the the Navajo people, and they're wrapping their heads around, is this the way that they want the money spent, right? Maybe, and I know we have we have a lot of sophisticated Navajo people, and we also have some people who may not be as familiar with some of these financing terms. So do you mind just kind of going into a little bit of what that, what is like kind of leveraging money when we say we're going to leverage the money? Like, I think you've kind of talked about like the borrowing against it, but maybe just really in real simple terms for people out there, like what are we, the government, the Winter government kind of proposing here on how to use that money?
Yeah. Just simply put, it's taking a pot of money that essentially is somebody else's money. It's the money the federal government gave to us.
Mhm.
It's not like revenue we've had to earn or, revenue that we've had to go find or selling an asset or whatever. It's just taking money that was basically given to us by the federal government and making that money work for us. And that's the leveraging piece, using the earnings off of it. It's like putting money in a bank account, say an interest savings account. And off of that savings account, say you get $500 a month, you take that $500 and you go buy a car with it. And with that $500 a month, you pay for the loan on the car. And once the car is, completed and you've paid off the loan, you still have the money in the bank. You still have the $500 a month. You can go buy another car with it, or you can finance a home with it. So that's essentially what we're doing. We're taking this money, or the idea, it hasn't been passed yet, but we're going to take this money, use the earnings off of it, borrow it, and go get some more assets out of it, buy more things, do more projects, um, specifically that will benefit uh, locals and Navajo people in the way of infrastructure and other capital projects.
Mm-hmm. And so you talked a little bit about the Bond Financing Act, that's going to need to maybe amended to be able to use the money in this manner. Is there what are the next steps in order for the fund to be fully realized?
So in the legislation, there is the requirement that another legislation is required to actually set up this fund. It sounds like the way the legal team is recommending is that we actually set up a trust fund. Whether or not we use that vehicle, we'll see. One way or another, the next step is to introduce a legislation that actually creates this fund. Um, and it should be mentioned. I think this is an important point to make because if there's a lot of chapter people out there wondering, the chapter projects within the current legislation, the legislation gives the power to the Office of the Controller to utilize what we call the UUFB, which is the unrestricted, unreserved fund balance, to continue chapter project funding. So none of the chapter projects will actually have to stop for a period of time while we wait for the creation of this fund. Those can continue forward. And I just met with the FRF office, which is the Fiscal Recovery Fund office, and the Department of Community Development on how this was going to work, so that none of these chapter projects have to wait while we do all this legal stuff to set up this fund. And that was actually given, the power was given to the controller to do that. But what needs to happen to actually set this fund, set aside fund up, is another legislation. And then we do, in order to increase the capacity for the Navajo Nation to borrow, to fully take advantage of the full amount of money, there will have to be an amendment to the Bond Financing Act, most likely some amendments to the Appropriations Act as well. But honestly, when I started doing a little bit of preliminary due diligence, reading the both of those act, it's been a while since they've actually been amended. We're talking 20 years in some cases. So it's really just time to kind of do that and kind of bring the capability at least into the modern era, and get Navajo in a position to at least have the ability to do something with it. Whether they do or not, it's up to them, but at least have that ability to leverage money and make the money work for us.
And just a little bit background: what is the purpose of the Bond Financing Act? It's been the Navajo Nation's had it for quite some time, but what's the overall purpose of that act serves for the nation?
So the Bond Financing Act, and I'm not a lawyer, but the way I read it, and from an accounting standpoint, that's what we call the enabling legislation. That's the legislation that allows the Navajo Nation to go out and seek financing vehicles like debt. And debt can come in many forms. When in a government situation, it could be a revenue bond where a government pledges part of their revenue to pay for the debt, or it could be a general obligation bond, or it could be a line of credit or just a simple commercial loan. And right now, the Bond Financing Act has some restrictions on it that limits the capability and the amount that the Navajo Nation could borrow. And so it's based on a kind of a vague definition of a revenue amount that could be used against it. And so or used to pay for debt. So just looking at that, um, what we're going to come back to the table with in this Bond Financing Act is language that helps define further different types of debt, because that's not really in there. And also really talk about what monies can be used to pay for debt and what can't, and then even put debt limits. I mean, the Navajo Nation wants to borrow and make the money work for us, but we want to do it responsibly as well. We don't want to over leverage our balance sheet and create debt problems for the Navajo Nation. And we can build in controls with the amendments of the Bond Financing Act to make sure things like that don't happen.
So, sounds like you have a lot of work. Sounds like you and me have a lot of work for us moving forward. But it sounds really exciting. I will say this has been a really exciting time to work for the Navajo Nation, and watching leaders like yourself and the delegates and the president, work through a lot of these issues on how to best utilize this money. So it's been, it's really exciting to be to see these conversations play out, and watch Navajo leaders kind of talk through, how to go about achieving the goals and the best way to use this Navajo Nation money. So, and at this time, I think we've talked a little bit about the money that was that's moving over into the 521, but just for clarity, there is some chapter money, correct, that is not being moved over to the 521.
Yeah.
And which, just for our viewers, so they're aware, which chapter projects are going to stay with ARPA as ARPA funded projects and still have their ARPA restrictions connected and deadlines attached to them?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. So as I mentioned before, any money that was actually already contracted as of March 31st for a chapter project will remain in ARPA.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality of the situation is the chapters, there wasn't much encumbered already by a lot of the chapters yet, with the exception of Chinle. Chinle had almost all of its money either spent or encumbered, the Chinle delegate plan, region plan, as of March 31st. But the rest of them had some here and there, and those that did, those will remain intact and be spent under the ARPA money. Everything else moved to 521.
And just a point of clarification, Controller, I think I definitely 100% right. And then there were some chapter projects, right, that were obligated between March and when the president signed this legislation in June.
Yeah.
I believe am I correct? Is that money also, if chapter obligated money during that time, that money will also stay as FRF project?
No, actually, I think that is actually now encumbered under the 521, because really what we did was the original allocation to the chapters was 211 million. What was moved over was roughly 150, which represented what wasn't spent um, or encumbered. So anything that happened after March 31st gets encumbered, but it's just now encumbered under the 521.
So I think we have. I don't know. Think we have any. Sorry. I apologize. I'm trying to monitor the comments, see if we have any questions. I know there was a question regarding just, why the federal government gave us the original ARPA money, and maybe you could just expand on that a little bit more, because I know you talked about that we received that money through ARPA, but why did the government, I guess, in the first place, even allocate money to tribes during the ARPA legislation?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it really should be understood that the American Rescue Plan Act gave money to all governments, not just tribes. States got it, cities got it, local governments got it. And so it's not unique to Navajo Nation. Every tribe in the nation got an amount. So did every state. And so it was really just the federal government recognizing this is an unprecedented pandemic. We shut down businesses, you know, people need money to get back on track. And so they allocated a large amount of money to bring America back out of the economic effects that the pandemic had. So and the way it worked for tribes was they calculated an amount that went to the tribe based on employment and on census data. And with ARPA in particular, they allowed tribes to self-certify their census. So the Navajo Nation got the biggest allocation of any tribe in the country based merely on the fact that census wise, it's one of the biggest, right, with Cherokee, but also they employ the number of employees that the Navajo Nation has. And that's what came out to, there was some big calculation they did, and that's what came out to the roughly $2.08 billion award, almost $2.1 billion.
Nice. And just looking at another question that came up. So when the 521, when council does create this fund, and I assume they will give it a much better name than the 521 fund that we have kind of been shorthanding giving it at this point. But when they do create this fund, where does, where will this fund then live within the kind of the general Navajo Nation, I guess, accounting system?
Yeah, so we'll do the mechanics internally to create what we refer to business unit or an account, and then the money will sit there and be able to be spent against. On our balance sheet, it'll appear as what we call committed fund balance. So it'll actually sit in the general fund. It won't be in the government funds anymore, because the government funds are federal money. This money is now reimbursed the general fund, so it becomes our general fund money, and it'll be committed for a purpose. So it'll stay there until that commitment is lifted.
Mm. And then how does the Navajo Nation invest money, this kind of money? Does it invest, I guess, this money? Is this money just sit in a fund and earn interest? Like how has council kind of structured the use of the investing of any of this money?
Yeah, that's another great question. So the entire 2.1 billion, roughly 2.1 billion that the Navajo Nation was received 2 years ago. We actually have that money currently earning interest in our investment portfolio. And that's one of the other beauties that came along with ARPA in particular, is the federal government basically told tribes, go ahead and putting in an investment account, and anything you earn off of it is yours to keep. A lot of federal programs don't allow you to do that, or they'll restrict the amount of money you can earn off of investing in. The federal government typically doesn't allow you to just take their money and earn money off of it. But in the ARPA case, it was actually a very forward, if I could say, a very forward-looking approach by the federal government to say, give it to tribes, let them put it in an investment account. Whatever the investment earns, they can keep it, and they can keep it, and it's completely unrestricted. So that's another pot of money, actually, that could be contemplated in the near future as part of a fund, because currently the portfolio is earning roughly 6%. So any of you mathematicians out there can do a quick and dirty on what 6% of $2.1 billion is over the course of 3 years,
Mhm.
and what it could be over the next 2 years as well.
Mhm. And then once the fund is created, and I think this is true for all like the CSN fund as well, once we create a fund and put the 521 money in the established fund, then is that also then invested to be used?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Like I said, the money is actually currently invested. So
Mhm.
really, we're just going to do an internal mechanics to move it over to a new investment account. But it's already there. We just allocated it differently now.
Mhm. And I think for the usage, right, all funds, the usage of the funds is really established by leadership. So as the worker bees that we are, we follow the direction that leadership gives us on how it wants the money utilized, or any restrictions, right, that will be placed on the 521 will come from leadership. And I think there's you kind of talked about it, that leadership, it sounds like leadership is looking to have this money be used for capital projects. And is that still the case? Is that, kind of in the discussions moving forward, is the council looking at having this fund be limited just for just for those kinds of capital projects for the nation?
Yeah, I think that's the discussion right now. I think what we're trying to avoid, whatever form this new fund takes,
Mm-hmm.
what we're trying to avoid is creating an account that can be used for general fund financing or whatever. That's something we're trying to avoid, because really, ultimately, the purpose of the ARPA funding, regardless of how we use it and what fund is paying, like whether we move it to the general fund or we keep it in ARPA, the purpose of the fund was to get tribes back on track and get needed infrastructure to respond to the pandemic, or even if there's a future pandemic. So right now, the discussions with leadership is, don't create a fund that this administration or this council or even a future one can utilize as kind of a fund that they can go and fund general fund operations. It should be a fund that it actually continues to serve the purpose of ARPA, which is creating infrastructure and capital related projects, so that Navajo people actually see the benefit from it, and it doesn't get buried behind government walls and being spent on you know purposes other than putting projects on the ground locally.
And when you say prevent it from being used for general fund operations, what's an example? What would be an example of a general fund operation that you would kind of make you cringe a little bit?
Yeah, like I just simply put, and not to throw myself or anyone under the bus, but if I just decided, yeah, I think the controller deserves a raise, and I'm going to fund it with money out of this fund, that's exactly the kind of thing we're trying to prevent.
Great. Well,
I'm not saying I don't deserve a raise, but no, I'm just kidding.
not from this money.
Yeah.
Not from this 521. Well, thank you, Controller. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today about this. And I think, this is at this time there still sounds like there's work to be done to get the fund in place and get the money working in a way that will be best for Navajo people. So it still sounds like there's some decisions to be made by our leadership moving forward. But I think the initial step, which was the decision made by the council to reallocate the money that wasn't being used for a lot of various other projects to this reserve. I always get my R's confused, but that's why I always call it the 521. To have that money moved from those projects as 521 is really the first step in kind of creating this more long-lasting source of funding for the Navajo people. And then I don't know, with the time that we have left, if there was kind of like any closing comments that you'd like to say, and just would like to say or communicate kind of as how you see this fund and just the next steps forward, or things that you would just like the Navajo people to know about this process moving forward.
Yeah, no, and just to provide further clarification, those that might see this or are listening in, the fund is referred to in a lot of different manners, and it should be known that they're all one and the same. So if you ever hear someone say, "Oh, it's the Revenue Replacement Fund," or "It's the Revenue Loss Fund," or "It's the 521 Fund," I think it was even called the Seven Generations Fund at one point. They're referring to the same thing. It's all the same thing. It's just called different. We do need to name it, and I think there's some names being thrown around. But right now, if you hear revenue loss or revenue replacement fund or 521 or any that, those are all one and the same. But I guess as far as final comments go, I want to echo something you said, Catherine, about it being an exciting time for Navajo. Um, I think the headlines that get put out there a lot of times, especially recently, have been a lot of negative, but there really are a lot of good things happening behind the scenes, and it's stuff that we can't just you know announce one day. It's all done. It's all over. There's a process to it, but there's a lot of work going on to really accomplish some kind of historic and great things. And a lot of credit goes to DOJ, yourself, Catherine, and Madam AG, and everyone who worked on not only the water rights settlement, but getting this ARPA thing figured out. Kind of reprioritizing the Office of the President and the team there. Just we all really just kind of came together. The leadership of the BNF committee under Chair Parrish and Speaker, and just really kind of came together and said, look, we got this big pot of money that we kind of have to rethink, and we did it in about 5 months, and got a legislation passed. So a lot of great things happen. My team at the Office of the Controller, which I know gets a lot of heat, but we're making some great changes too to really streamline some things and break down the red tape, modernize practices, and just get ourselves in the modern way of doing business so that we don't keep running into red tape issues and the Navajo people have to suffer. So, like you said, a great, exciting time to be part of this team. And a lot of credit goes to Catherine, you and your team at DOJ for helping out with this. And of course, again, as I mentioned, the council, the Budget Finance Committee, President Nygren, Vice President Montoya, and the team there at OPVP as well.
Thanks. Thank you, Comptroller. Yeah, and I guess just my last words are I really commend the Navajo leaders. This was not an easy process, and the hours upon hours that were spent meeting with between Comptroller and Council and OPVP to, I feel like people really took these decisions seriously and really agonized over how to move forward. So I think, the next step is really now deciding, now that this money has been set aside, how does the nation and the Navajo people want to structure using it? Do they want to keep it for those capital projects? Do they want to prioritize senior centers? I see a lot of comments in the chat about senior centers. Is that something that the Navajo people and their leaders want to, prioritize the usage of this money? I think that's I think is really exciting, is that it's possible, and it's just really up to whatever the Navajo people and leaders think will be the best usage for it and help, provide a better Navajo nation. So with that, we'll just sign off, and thank you guys all for listening, and just keep your eyes on upcoming developments on this fund and the usage of this money. We're very excited to continue to provide the information to people as developments occur. So thank you, everyone, and have a great Friday.
Thank you all.